Well, it is my honor to introduce to you Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown. Lerita is a retreat leader, a speaker, spiritual companion, and professor emerita of psychology at Agnes Scott College. With a BA from the University of California and a PhD from Harvard University, and a certificate from the Shalem Institute for Spiritual Formation, Brown frequently speaks on contemplative spirituality and Howard Thurman. Brown is the author of numerous articles, essays, and an edited volume, and is the author of two books, When the Heart Speaks, Listen, Discovering Inner Wisdom, and her most recent book, What Makes You Come Alive, A Spiritual Walk with Howard Thurman, which was recently released by Broadleaf Books. She has been featured in PBS documentaries about Howard Thurman and the Black Church, and she lives in Stone Mountain, Georgia. So Lerita, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful today, and I'm just honored and happy to be a part of this Christian Mystic Summit.
Well, thank you. That makes me happy to hear. So, today we're exploring Howard Thurman and his sacred activism and prophetic mysticism. And I've been reading through this beautiful book just recently released and truly enjoying it. I may have questions about that along the way, but as we approach this conversation around Thurman, maybe it's best to just start with the basic definition. What is a mystic?
Well, there's several definitions of mystics out there, but I think after having read a number of them and certainly truly studied Howard Thurman, I think a mystic is an individual who has an experience of God, perhaps maybe transcendent in nature. I always often like to describe it as a direct experience of God without any mediation. But also a person who has chosen to surrender to that connection and to live a life rooted in God and from God. Thurman sort of describes it as the mystic yields the nerve center of their being to God. I think that's a way that I want to describe it. I think many of us, and I would include myself, have had mystical experiences, but I'm not sure if I or many people who have had those are willing to surrender their entire lives to God. So, it's sort of a work in progress.
Yes, thank you. I like that. That surrender piece seems quite critical to go the whole way, to complete the journey in a sense. So yeah, appreciate that. Well, why don't we start? We're talking about Howard Thurman, and maybe you share, if you don't mind, your journey with Howard. How is it that you came to find him and his work?
Well, it's actually much related to this Christian Mystic Summit. I was finishing up my program at Shalem in spiritual guidance, and we had studied a few mystics, probably more so St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila. And so I really wanted to, I was really curious actually about whether or not there were any African or African-American mystics, because I had not really heard about them as such. And so I started asking around, and one of my clergy friends says, "You mean you haven't heard of Howard Thurman?" And I was actually shocked and dismayed that I had not heard of him, because I considered myself a highly educated person and way into my life before I ran across him. And when I opened up the first book that I bought, Meditations of the Heart, I was like, oh my goodness. This wisdom was just extraordinary, just kind of flowing out of the pages. And so I did some more investigating, and I decided to write my final project on him. And and when I did, it was just the tip of the iceberg. As I learned in writing a book about him, that there was so much.
Yeah, beautiful Beautiful. And how would you go about, describing even Howard Thurman as a mystic? I mean, he was religious, but he wasn't a cloistered person. He wasn't a monk. So how is it that you think that Thurman became a mystic in his own right?
It's so funny because lots of people talk about him being a mystic. I don't think he ever described himself as a mystic, which I find, I think he really wanted to talk, or perhaps maybe to spark in other people a sense of the presence of God, but he didn't feel as if talking about his own personal mystical experiences was necessarily a part of that. But he started having mystical experiences as a young boy, outside in nature. And so some people have labeled him a nature mystic. I'm not, I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with those kinds of terms, because I think if you're a mystic, you're a mystic. And those experiences with God can happen anywhere. And Thurman would say that they could be in nature, they could be doing worship, they could be doing prayer. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, in a hospital room. Yeah, so I don't think there's any place where, God is absent. And so those experiences can happen anywhere. So, but as a young boy, he also was a bit terrorized. So he was born on November 11th, 1899, and grew up in Daytona Beach, Florida, primarily, in a time when it was pretty terrorizing for uh, Black boys, men in particular. And so he decided that rather than, as he says, allowing the fear to corrode his spirit, he turned inside to God. And so he started meditating underneath an oak tree near his house. And he said he had a relationship with the tree, that he felt like the tree understood him, and he would, go there to bring his joys as well as his sorrows. And so he he describes in his autobiography, With Head and Heart, the autobiography of Howard Thurman, how he used to walk along the Atlantic Ocean and feel like he was connected to the sun, the trees, and the wind. And, they were all, breathing through one lung, or he was a part of them, or he was a part of them, and they were a part of him. He, talks about how he could experience a connection with flowers and trees, and so he sort of felt like that these experiences were drawing him closer to God, not necessarily religion per se, but to God. So he was having these mystical experiences without any vocabulary for what they were, and it really wasn't until later in his life, when he happened to run across a copy of Finding the Trail of Life, written by the eminent Quaker mystic Rufus Jones, who basically was describing his mystical experiences as a young boy in the book. And he said that, he just, after he read it, he knew that he was going to have to go study with him. He didn't know how it was going to happen. And I would say through a series of holy coincidences, he found himself at Haverford College for a semester and studied with Rufus Jones, who opened up his entire library to him, and also included him in his seminar on Meister Eckhart. But he basically was able to study St. Francis of Assisi and St. Teresa of Avila, St. John the Cross, just all the great mystics. And that is when he understood that there was a sort of domain of religion, or a domain of religious experience that we now, we obviously call mysticism, but he was not aware that existed. So, and I would say that both he and Rufus Jones were mystics first, and then understood what a mystic was.
Uh-huh.
Right.
Well said. And I think, yeah, I love the universality that divine encounter in nature. Like even before we use the word God, like having that experience, because nature is available to all people in all places, and so not mediated by religion or belief or doctrine in that. So
And I think it was true, for me. I think that's why I was so drawn to him, that as a little girl, I used to sit out in the wind and really feel this sense of peace and serenity. And on occasion, I would go in and, say to my family, I was out there and I felt like the sun, the moon, and the trees all at once. And they would sort of look at me like, and so later I learned that I was having a mystical experience, when I got older, but certainly didn't understand or use those words, at that time. So, uh,
yeah, beautiful, beautiful to share that with Thurman. And as you're talking about his like experiences as a young boy, and then his like later academic career. Maybe give us what you can, a snapshot of his life, even because I think it's so interesting how well he was truly an academic and a writer and wrote so many books. And so, what was his academic life like, and how did mysticism influence that?
so as I mentioned, he was born and raised in Daytona Beach, Florida. He lost his father when he was about 7 years old to pneumonia. He was a gentleman who worked on the railroad and came home on the weekends. And there was an incident related to that where the local church, Baptist church that he and his mother and grandmother and two sisters attended. His father was more of an intellectual type, not a traditional churchgoer. They refused to host his funeral because they said he didn't go to church, and so he had died outside of Christ, and so they were not going to allow it. So a local preacher came, said, "Look, I'll do it." Sort of more of a traveling minister agreed to do that, but he took the opportunity to condemn Saul Thurman to death, to hell, for not going to church. And Thurman at age 7 or 8 was very confused. He was like, what kind of religion is this? And that was sort of a turning point for him in terms of trying to differentiate between sort of religion and experience of God, right?
Mm.
Or sort of religion doctrines, dogma and creeds. And because he felt like, character was more important than whether or not somebody was going to church every week. So that was a turning point for him, as well as then being raised by his grandmother and mother. His grandmother had been a slave. And as an enslaved person, they were allowed to have a preacher come and preach to them once a year. And there was one particular preacher who would come and tell them at the end of his sermon, "You are not, slaves, you are not the N-word, you are holy children of God." And so she would tell this story to Howard and his sisters every time she saw them kind of losing their sense of self-confidence due to their second-class citizenship in that environment there in Daytona Beach, Florida in the early 1900s. So one of the things that Thurman received in that through his grandmother was a sense of worthiness, inherent worthiness, because of being created by God, and sort of like an inoculation of sorts against all the other negativity in the social environment. Very smart student, did very well in school, and unfortunately at the time, Black children could only matriculate to the 7th grade. That's just was sort of all that they would offer them. So by de facto would not be able to go to high school unless they had an 8th grade certificate. So the community came together and decided that because he was such a excellent student, that they would have him tutored by one of the local principals so that he could pass that exam. And he did. And he went on to the Florida Baptist Academy in Jacksonville, Florida, which was a residential academy for Black students in Florida. I think there were about 3 at the time. He did well there, graduated valedictorian of his class. And as a result of that, received a tuition scholarship to Morehouse College here in Atlanta, Georgia, a men's college. And a place that has obviously graduated great Black leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I could just go down the list of people that have come through that college. But he also graduated valedictorian of his class there. And there's a story that follows him that says that he read every book in the library at the time, and I wouldn't doubt it. Then he goes on to what was then called Colgate Rochester Seminary, and was again an excellent student and graduated valedictorian of his class there. So just, I think a voracious reader, inquisitive, and brilliant. Is just probably the best way to describe him. And always sort of searching, I think would probably be the best way to describe him, about new ideas, and about how he could pass on what he learned to the congregations and to the people that he encountered. And I think probably the big turning point for him in his work was not only studying with Rufus Jones, and I want to talk a little bit more about that because Jones introduced him to a different form of mysticism that I think most people are aware of, which was called affirmation mysticism, and contrasted that with what he called negation mysticism, where one is more isolated and away from society. Affirmation mysticism is more of a, you're living in the world, and when you go down inside to God, you come up into what he described at that time as community, but was basically oneness or unity. So they had, like I said, a wonderful semester working together, but Thurman was not quite satisfied with some of the work that he did with Jones, and so he went on to expand it. He had a little difficulty because people were criticizing him at the time for studying mysticism. Particularly Black religious leaders were saying, we need, tools for liberation. What's this lofty mysticism stuff? But Thurman found the study of mysticism just extraordinary for him because he felt like there was a pathway there to social change, which sort of moved it into a realm of kind of prophetic mysticism as opposed to the typical sort of mystical experience that one has, and it continues with that individual relationship with God. This is a more of a expanding, kind of mysticism. So, and he also wanted to destigmatize the word mysticism as well as the word mystic. I think he sort of felt like, anytime you mention the word, people begin to feel uneasy, don't quite want to talk about it. But he really tried to come up with new terms like creative encounter or religious experience, as opposed to using the word mysticism. And I sort of feel like he wanted to show people that there was nothing scary about mysticism.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. And I love that he's just that ordinary person involved in the ordinary world and in a very unique time. And ordinary and brilliant. I mean, here's somebody that is valedictorian once, is valedictorian twice, is valedictorian a third time, just brilliant and ordinary, just living an ordinary life. But maybe tell us more of that prophetic mysticism. What did that look like in Thurman's life, or why is it relevant for us today?
Well, so I think once he found this pathway into the study of mysticism, he expanded this idea of affirmation mysticism, and began to write in the late 30s about mysticism and social change. Again, as I said, in this form, you go down inside to God and come up inside to oneness. And that the goal really of the mystic was to try to restore this oneness that has always been a part of us, but has somehow or other been severed by this sense of separation. And that there was this connection. I just want to read a quote by him that I think is just so relevant here. He says, social action is an expression of resistance against whatever tends to or separate one from the experience of God, who is the very ground of our being. The mystic's concern with the imperative of social action is not merely to improve the conditions of society. It is not merely to improve, is not merely to feed the hungry, nor merely to relieve human suffering and misery. If this were all in and of itself, it would be important, surely, but this is not all. The basic consideration has to do with the removal of all that prevents God from coming into itself in the life of the individual. Whatever there is that blocks this calls for action. So he actually was sort of, I would say, operating at a much more deeper level. It wasn't just about righting injustices. And that was very important to him because in some ways, he had been challenged by one of his professors in seminary who basically said to him, you know what, you're brilliant. And I understand that you might have this social issue like racism as a problem, but really, you need to be focused on the timeless hunger of the human spirit. And Thurman was kind of like, okay, but in reality, I have to deal with being in this Black body, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he wanted to find some way to help in the liberation as well as in the restoration of the dignity of people who were like him, who lived on the, out sort of on the margins of society and who were not accepted and who were, being mistreated in some ways with all of this, legalized segregation. He wanted to work on that, but he also wanted to help people understand that, if we can't move towards this racial reconciliation, we will never have union with God. So it wasn't just about the social justice. It was about, we're trying to get back to the oneness. And as a mystic, I think he understood that, but that we can't get back there until we are able to resolve this issue that we have with the other, that we can't have people worshiping God in separate churches or in separate parts of the church, and expect that that's okay, right? Because it's separating the oneness. And he felt, strongly as well as about the environment that, we have exploited, nature and animals, and that we needed to, again, understand our connection to them and to the oneness. So he was really about, restoring that. He also, created some categories for different kinds of mystics. So, he understood that not everybody was going to live in a cloistered religious community and pray all day, et cetera, right? So, but that was a special kind of mystic, as well as what he referred to himself as, and Rufus Jones, as light within mystics. So these were people that, as it is in the Quaker tradition, that everybody has a light within them and they carry that with them wherever they go. And so the divinity lives within. So he certainly, believed that about himself and about them. But he was also open to mystics of other faith traditions, Hindu mystics like Gandhi, or, Sufi mystics. We think about Rumi and Hafiz. I mean, there were, so there are all these different kinds of mystics, And that's okay. And there even, he even had a category for what he called the occult, right? So people who were into numerology or whatever, right? That there could, be mystics in that realm as well. So, he wanted people to understand that, but to understand too, that mysticism was natural. That, people were going to, from time to time, have mystical experiences, and that, that happens to, could happen to anybody at any time. And so it wasn't just holy people, would-be saints, it was really a way in which we have a connection with God. And like I said, it could happen anywhere. So the prophetic dimension comes into play when he begins to write about Jesus as a leader of a nonviolent, cooperation or civil, sort of a religion engaged in civil disobedience. He really felt like he was very interested in the religion of Jesus as opposed to the religion about Jesus. So what was Jesus doing every day on a regular basis, right? So he was basically non-violently moving against the injustices of his time. I mean, he was a poor Jew living in Roman occupied territory. So he was just a great role model for how is it that one moves or resist, government sanctioned injustices. So he found that, in the Gospels that Jesus was providing ample information for what you need to do, particularly about better understanding your inner life and who has control over it. Because he says basically the person who has control over your inner life holds the keys to your destiny. So as he's writing about, as he's moving in and out of this writing about mysticism, he's also writing about here's a mystic, right, who is offering his people a way out of their circumstances by helping them to understand that they were created by God. So there's no need for them to feel that they are unworthy in any way, and that they need to have an accurate portrayal of their selves, which means that if you come from God, there's no need for you to question your worthiness in some ways. But that you needed to internalize that sense of I'm a child of God. And that act in and of itself begins to help stabilize your ego enough for you to then summon the courage to begin to engage in acts of nonviolent disobedience. So he put this all in a book called Jesus and the Disinherited, and it served as the blueprint for the civil rights movement. So basically, many civil rights leaders in the United States met Howard Thurman on the pages of Jesus and the Disinherited. You had people like Bayard Rustin and James Lawson and Polly Murray, all engaged in direct, they basically called it nonviolent direct action prior to the larger civil rights movement that occurred. And Thurman, I should say King also read Jesus and the Disinherited while he was in seminary. But, and this is what's so remarkable about spirit and about mysticism, et cetera, Thurman's wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, and Alberta King, Martin Luther King's mother, were roommates in high school. So you wonder whether or not, spirit was sort of setting this up from some other, before there's even a thought of Martin Luther King Jr. But so then you begin to see these connections to his calling to write about this and to encourage people in the United States in other colonized countries, in places where, imperialism had sort of taken over, to be of good courage, to understand who they were, and to continue to seek God in everything. And so he spent much of his life trying to utilize mysticism as a way to spark that sense of presence in others. He felt like spirituality could not be taught, but it could be caught, that sort of sense of presence. So serious champion of silence and stillness, particularly corporate, or as they called it then, but group or congregational silence. Felt that it was very healing. And he, wrote a lot, wrote a book, The Creative Encounter, specifically speaking about mysticism, and gave a number of sermons on the great mystics. So he was what I want to call it. He was an one person described him as a as a mystic activist, where you're combining, your gift of mysticism with again trying to remove all those barriers, all those things that are keeping this oneness from happening. So
beautiful. Beautiful. I mean, that feels like his unique contribution to the mystic, that prophetic angle, that it's about justice, and it's that moving away of the block, anything that gets in the way of that union is what calls for the justice. And yeah, a really remarkable contribution really to what is the mystic and what's another category. So you talked about him as a sacred activist, or a sacred, so we have like activism, we have political activism, social activism. How would you differentiate his role? How did he model for us sacred activism, and how is that different than political or social activism as we think of it today?
Right. So what was so beautiful about Thurman and his life is that he was relentless about encouraging people to pay attention to the spirit. And I came to understand that activism becomes sacred when you invite the spirit in for, I call it consultation, guidance about what to do and when. And we began to see in even the training for the civil rights movement, people being taught to go in first, find your center of peace before you go out into violent confrontation. And there's a beautiful scene in the movie Selma where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is leading a group of people, about to lead a group of people across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and he stops and he kneels down, takes a moment to pray, and then he gets up and turns everybody around. People thought he was crazy, right? But that was just such a beautiful example of sacred activism. It's like, Spirit said, not today. So I have found, and I try to advocate for sacred activism as much as I can, even among activists, young activists who are getting burned out, because there's always something, right? There's always something going on, and it seems like every day we have a new thing that we need to address. But it's easy to get burned out, and so one of the ways, or I should say, one of a couple of ways that I think we need to address this ongoing situation is one, to understand what your inner authority is, and that is, and I have sort of two forms of inner authority. Inner authority being your sense of agency, your sense of being able to say yes or no to whatever is going on in an interaction. I oftentimes will, say to people, sometimes the best thing that you can do in a circumstance is to exit graciously, right? But at the same time, we can also incorporate into our lives what I call inner authority, capital I, capital A, where we pause and ask the Spirit, okay, so what do I need to do in this circumstance? Let me just take a pause, listen, and then you'll get a message about, should I, engage this person? Should I walk away? What do I need to do under these circumstances? So that's really important as a spiritual practice, as far as I'm concerned. And that kind of, giving decisions up for discernment, if it's a big, large one, and Thurman was very good about that throughout his life. When he was offered the job at Boston University, and they kept sort of, coming back to him saying, well, what do you think? What do you think? And he said, I'm waiting for a word in my heart. So there are many times in his life where he basically didn't listen to all the chatter around him and utilized his inner authority, right? To say, this is what I'm doing. I know you all think I'm crazy to leave Howard University, tenured job, and go start the first intentional, interdenominational, interracial church in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm doing, right? And you can talk about me till, the cows go home, or whatever the phrase is, but I'm not, this is what I'm doing. So that's it. That's that inner authority of agency. I know what I need to do. But, he also had those times when, he understood that he needed to wait and listen for an answer for a big decision. And I was actually utilizing that particular kind of discernment in my own life. I'm a double transplant recipient, and I think I'm still alive 28 years after having a transplant, because I engage in that all the time with the medical community. So I think it's important, to ask. And, sometimes you'll get a sign that, okay, this is what I need to do, or this is what I don't need to do. Because, sometimes we're uncertain about what it is. But I think the most important part of this process is understanding what your sacred call is. And that was something that Thurman also advocated for and lived. What are you being called to do? And he would ask people all the time, sort of two questions, who are you really? So without all this, the titles and, all of that stuff, who are you really? And, what are you here to do? Have you listened for the sound of the genuine in you, right? Are you doing what you need to do? So he understood he was not here to be Martin Luther King Jr. He was here to be Howard Thurman. And as Howard Thurman, he felt his call was to hold the space, the spiritual space, and to create whatever needed to be created so that all of these people who felt called to march could do that. But they could also come to him for advice and counsel. I think that what's so important for us in the times that we live in, although I keep telling people have been living in these times forever, right? I mean, there's aspects of our times right now are like the Old Testament, and some that are like the New Testament. And it's happening all at once. And so it's really important, if you don't want to be overcome by the world, to be listening for your sacred call. Mm-hmm. Because as we know, in the civil rights movement and other major social movements, not everybody was on the street. There were people cooking, people taking care of children. There were journalists, there were, writers, there were actors, there were artists, all kinds of people doing all kinds of things, musicians. And so all of those people were a part of that movement being a movement. Mm-hmm. But I believe, and I think Thurman believed this as well, is that everybody's called. I think we get kidnapped by that scripture in Matthew, many are called, few are chosen. I think all are called, few choose to listen. Because basically, as our sort of ego selves, we want to do what we want to do when we want to do it. So it's really hard for us to surrender and to say, okay, I understand I'm being called over here, even though I would really like to be over there. But spirit needs to be over here. Mm. So I think that Thurman lived that out. He did what he felt that he needed to do. Like there was a time when Dr. King got stabbed by a mentally ill woman in Harlem in 1958. And Thurman said he started having visions of King. And so he told his wife, look, I've got to go to New York. I think they were in Boston at the time. And find him and talk to him. And he did. And he told him, I know that you are very much involved in this movement, but I think it's taken on a life of itself. And I think you need to take some time off for some silence and some stillness and solitude so that you can really know what your role is going to be in all of this. Mm-hmm. And I think they said it was one of the few times that King did take any time off, or extra time or whatever. And then he went to India to study, nonviolence and civil disobedience. So it's so important in this world that seems to be chaotic and crazy and out of control that we, take some time to go inside and to listen for what we are being called to do. And, in his book of Meditations of the Heart, he has about 3 or 4 books of meditations, but in that particular book, he has one called A Lull in Doing. And he says every day we need to just stop, and just, even if it's like 5 minutes, just take a lull in the doing, so that we can kind of reconnect, because he saw meditation, he understood that what he was doing underneath that tree when he was 7 or 8 years old was meditation. Mm-hmm. So can you imagine someone who'd been meditating since they were like 7 or 8? Like meeting the Dalai Lama or something. Mm-hmm. So, and people felt that presence around him, by the way. But that it was so important for us to connect with God on a regular basis like that, because it helps to renew the spirit, and that's the way that we don't get burned out, that we're making that regular connection. So, he also believed that, our spiritual growth, our spirituality, our mysticism is not just for us personally, it's for everybody. Which is why once you get to a certain level of spiritual maturity, it's time for you then to be living out that call or that purpose to help restore God's beloved creation. So I think he lived that.
It's amazing, and yeah, so empowering to the individual to connect with, the that which is genuinely ours to do. It's so empowering to do that. It's not trying to be someone else or trying to follow someone else's path. Like you said, he was not called to be Dr. King. He was called to be Dr. Thurman. And it's amazing to me just thinking about the civil rights movement, which feels like a very active doing thing, but the foundation of it, as you were saying, is Thurman's words, his books, this mysticism. So this physical change that's happening, that we're demanding change, and then the spiritual reality that's underneath it, that was a foundation that I think, as you point to, like, is overlooked in its history. So.
Oh yes, and I think that people don't understand. As a matter of fact, there have been a few people out there that said, a movement without a spiritual base is just an angry mob. Mm-hmm. I can't remember now who actually said that, but what's, I think, important is that to sustain a movement, to sustain oneself, to sustain change over time, you need that spiritual connection, because I really do believe that spirit was at work long before, people were thinking about the civil rights movement, right? It's just, like I said, like, to think that the Thurmans and the Kings were connected. As a matter of fact, when they went to India and met with Gandhi in the 1930s. They spent about 6 months there, but they in the last couple of weeks, they got to meet. And Gandhi, of course, encouraged them to engage in these practices, starting small, he said, and, sort of working yourselves up. But when they got back to the United States, one of their first stops was the Thurmans was with the Kings. They had dinner. And Martin Luther King Jr. would have been about 7 years old at the time. We don't know if he was at the table or if he was anywhere around, but that's just incredible. So I think sometimes we get a little bit impatient with spirit. And, we want to get it going or make it happen yesterday. And I used to tell my students all the time, we're still making history. We're still making history. I know you want to. And when I look at all the history that I've seen over my lifetime, I mean, it's incredible, right? But, I probably in my 20s, I didn't understand either. So, I have to have a bit of compassion for, those who don't have that sense of history. Yeah, I think he gave us just a treasury. I mean, Emory Library has, the Pitt Library at Emory University has a wonderful archive of many of his digital recordings, sermons, papers. You can just actually go there and, write Howard Thurman and type in subjects. I mean, there's just wonderful stuff. You can listen or you can read, but it's just a treasury of wisdom that is timeless. So that means that he also fulfilled that other purpose to feed the timeless hunger, right? I mean, he's still feeding us. More than 40 years after he passed away, it's still feeding us. So yeah, great mystic in our contemporary times. So,
Amen, amen. And if he were to be here today, what do you think he would share with us?
Well, certainly, he had this famous phrase that he says, the contradictions of life are not final. And he was one who felt that life, and he often pointed to nature, was always recreating itself. No matter what, you could have a forest fire and just knock out trees. And he would, talk about the jack pine cones. There are certain trees that in order for it to generate new trees, you have to have a certain level of heat, right? Or he would, he'd say, look at life, look at it in the wintertime. It looks dead, but it's still somewhere deep inside is just regenerating so that it can come out again in the springtime. So I think sometimes we look around the world and just think, oh, there's just too much going on. There's, it's just horrible. And I think he would say the contradictions of life are not final. And, it might be important for you to garner a bit of courageous hope. And when you wake up in the morning, ask, okay, so what am I being called to do today about whatever it is that spirit wants me to do, right? And it may not be anything big. It may be just to go check on your neighbor. But I think it's, he would say, do not despair, right? That it looks daunting, but it's been daunting before. And it may be daunting again before it's all said and done. But, to look to whatever it is that makes you come alive, and be out there doing that and sharing that as much as you can with other people. It's so easy. I'm sure he would also say it's so easy to get caught up in the world, right? But to continue to remind yourself that you are not of this world. You just happen to be here, but you're not of this world. So hey, and read some Howard Thurman. Right? Like I left you a lot of stuff, so
yeah, how many books? Can you remind me if you know the number?
like 21 books.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, he's just got one book of sort of meditations and writings about Christmas and other celebrations, called The Mood of Christmas and Other Celebrations. And they're just beautiful prayers for the holidays. But lots of books of meditation. And of course, people are constantly writing books about him. But, another one coming out this year from a conference called The Unfinished Business of the Search for Common Ground. Because after King died, he actually wrote a book called The Search for Common Ground. I mean, it's kind of like, because he was trying to understand, how can we get people back together? Because he felt like so many of the divisions that we have are humanly imposed. God didn't ask us to create separate churches, really.
Well, Lerita, thank you so much. You've given us so much, including not only your time today, but your words here. And so, where are good places for people to connect with you?
So I have a website, LeritaColemanBrown.com. And I try to keep, I've got some information about Thurman and the link to the Pitt Library up there. I also have information about, events that I'm, currently involved in, as well as, just a place for people. I do blog. I haven't blogged in a while because I was getting the book out, but I need to get back to writing sort of a blog just about sort of daily living, and how we can incorporate more spirituality in our daily living. I'm also on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, all those sort of places and spaces. But I am just, wanting to find ways to encourage people to not give up, to not give in, but to really listen for, what they are being called to do, and to go do that, you will be supported in whatever way you need to be supported to fulfill whatever purpose you're here for.
Amen. Amen to that. Lerita, thank you. I'm so glad that you did that listening for the sound of the genuine, and it so clearly shines through that you're doing that. So thank you, Lerita.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I continue to find lots of people still have not ever heard of Howard Thurman. And so part of my call was to expose him to, the spiritual community, to the spiritual seekers out there who would really benefit from his wisdom. And so I'm so grateful to be a part of this Christian Mystic Summit, and to make sure that he's also included among the mystics that we talk about when we talk about mystics. So
thank you. And he will be, and going with us forward. So
yeah.
thank you, Lerita.
Thank you.